On November 9th, 1985, three members of the Walker clan left a farmhouse on a Kentucky hill and slipped into dark timber above the hollow. By sunrise, 13 men lay dead across 8 miles of gravel and dirt road. All were local fathers and sons tied to one new run of clear whiskey. All dropped fast by rifle fire in the cold. The killers, led by quiet Elias Eli Walker, with 2 hard bloodkin at his side, moved through those ridges like a combat unit. Sheriff Boyd Hensley would later call it the coldest, most exact night of killing his county had ever seen. But the cause was not drugs, was not cash, was not even some long, loud feud. It was a battered copper still and a stolen family recipe that changed hands in secret. If you have the courage to hear this tale, settle in, hit subscribe, and listen close. Where are you watching from tonight, and what does your family code say about a story like this? Wherever you're watching from, you need to see this place first. In 1985, that county sat in the eastern Kentucky hills, closer to old strip mines than to any real city. One 2-lane road ran through town. A low brick courthouse, a tired school, and a handful of stores lined the street. At night, you could stand under the blinking light at the only stop sign and hear dogs bark clear across the hollow. On payday Fridays, the road filled with dusty pickups. Most other days, Main Street looked like it was holding its breath. Years before the massacre, the big coal seam that fed that town had thinned out. The company pulled machines and bosses and never really came back. Men who'd swung a pick or run a loader for decades woke up with no shift to go to. Unemployment checks stretched thin. Gardens, hogs, and deer filled some of the gap, but cash stayed short. Folks fixed their own cars, patched their own roofs, and learned to do without more often than not. Pride kept many from leaving, even when cousins up north sent letters about factory work and steady pay. Down near the river, a squat block building held the last real general store. The paint had peeled from the sign, but inside, the place still smelled like feed, coffee, and oiled wood. People bought flour, canned milk, shotgun shells, and school tablets there. More important than the goods was the little notebook behind the counter. The owner, an old friend of Eli Walker, wrote down who owed what and when they'd promised to bring it. Sometimes they paid in cash, sometimes in meat, in labor, and in jars that came out of the hills at night. Moonshine had been part of that ridge life since before anybody then was born. To some, it was just wrong, a sin and a crime. To others, it was rent money and grocery money when nothing else came in. Men cut mash in old tubs, fired hidden stills, and sent jars out by trusted hands. Trucks with out-of-state plates rolled through after dark, taking cases towards cities that never knew the name of the hollow they came from. A quiet rule lived under all that trading. You didn't talk, you didn't cheat a partner, and you didn't touch another man's recipe. Law sat in an uneasy place inside that mix. The sheriff's office knew about the jars and the backdoor deals. So did the state boys when they came through. But with layoffs, old cars, and worn boots all around, they picked their battles. Raids came now and then, mostly when somebody got loud or careless. The rest of the time, folks lived by their own code. A man's word, his craft, and his family name meant more on that hill than any distant paper. Those quiet ties, built over years of hard seasons, would later become the same lines Eli Walker pulled tight when the theft of his still finally cut too deep. Before a single shot rang out on that November night, the stage was already set by these pressures. Every favor, every shared meal, every ride given on a muddy road tied people together in ways outsiders seldom see. When one man rose or fell, a dozen followed behind him. In a place like that, stealing was never just about property. It was about pride and place in the line. Keep that in mind, because the next step in this story is the man who carried that pride like a weight, Elias Walker in those Kentucky hills. Morning came early on the Walker place. Before first light, Eli was on the back porch, pulling on his boots with slow, careful hands. Frost silvered the yard, and a thin line of smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. He stood still for a moment, listening to the quiet creak and a far dog bark on another ridge. People in town thought he was just a tired ex-miner, worn down by years underground. They saw the limp in his right leg, the scars on his hands, and the way he kept his eyes on the ground when he walked Main Street. What they didn't see was how much he noticed in return. Inside, Lena moved between the stove and the table, setting out biscuits, eggs, and a jar of canned peaches. Jesse, the older boy, sat with his elbows off the table like his mother had taught him, boots muddy from checking traps before dawn. Mark, 2 years younger and sharper with books than tools, flipped through a worn football magazine while he ate. Their house was small, boards thin enough that winter wind found every crack, yet it held the weight of 3 generations. Eli's father had died on that hill, and his own father before that. Land and name were what they left behind, along with one more thing people couldn't see from the road. Down a narrow path behind the barn, hidden by laurel and rock, sat the Walker still. Copper shone dully in the dim light when Eli lifted the tarp. His father had bent that metal by hand, hammer marks running like rings on an old tree. The shape and the way the coil cooled the run were tricks passed from grandfather to son, never written down. Eli could look at a jar and tell who made it by smell alone, but only his whiskey carried a certain clean burn that folks in 3 counties knew. It wasn't just liquor to him, it was proof his people had made something fine in a hard place. Years earlier, Eli had gone from that hill to a different kind of dark. The army shipped him to a jungle he never spoke about in detail. When he came home, his hair had thinned and his laugh was softer. Coal mines took him next, deep under rock where roof bolts and dust filled his days. Friends were crushed or choked in slow ways, and he learned that danger doesn't always shout. He learned to plan, to read small signs in air and stone, and to react without panic. Those habits followed him back to the farm, into the way he ran his still, and into the way he watched other men. Folks around town carried their own ideas about Eli. At the store, men might nod and call him by name, yet few pressed for talk. Sheriff Hensley had grown up 2 grades behind him, played ball on the same dirt field, and knew Eli's temper ran slow but deep. The preacher knew that when a family lost someone in a minefall or wreck, an envelope sometimes showed up under their door with cash that had no return address. A retired foreman could recall Eli stepping between 2 angry miners in a tunnel, moving calm and sure, talking low until the fight drained away. Over time, people learned that if Eli promised something, he meant it, and if he felt crossed, he remembered. That mix of memory, pride, and quiet favors would become his sharpest weapon when Royce Kincaid reached for the still and tried to claim it. Royce Kincaid lived 3 miles down the ridge from the Walkers, in a leaning white house with junk cars and barking dogs in the yard. Paint flaked off the porch posts, yet flowers still grew in old coffee cans by the steps. Folks said Royce could talk a tree into giving shade. He remembered birthdays, asked after sick kin, and never walked into the store without greeting half the room. Where Eli slipped along the edges, Royce planted himself in the middle, laughing big, telling stories, making people feel like their troubles would shrink if they just stood near him. That charm hid a hard truth. The coal cutbacks had sliced through Royce's income just like everyone else's. He hauled scrap, traded tools, sold a little of whatever folks needed. A few jars moved through his hands each week, quiet and quick. Behind on his banknote and staring at doctor bills for a sick daughter, he lay awake nights, counting debts instead of sheep. From his porch, he could see the dark line of timber on the Walker place. He knew the jars that drifted down from that hill always brought the best price with out-of-county buyers. Working with Eli started as simple hauling. Royce used his trucks to move sealed boxes to quiet buyers, no questions asked. Over time, he found reasons to linger when Eli cooked mash. He toted water, chopped wood, watched the way Eli tested heat with a fingertip, and smelled the steam. Eli, worn from years of labor and used to Royce's company, let him stand closer than most. People in the hollow saw the 2 men together and said it was good to see neighbors helping each other keep food on the table when the mines no longer could. In a cramped shed behind his own house, lit by a single bulb, Royce began to copy what he thought he had learned. He drew the curve of Eli's still on cardboard, bent scrap copper with a nephew's help, and set a small fire under the first batch. The run tasted harsh and thin. Each time he tried again, he filed an edge, lengthened a coil, shifted the water barrel, chasing that clean burn his buyers praised. After months of tinkering, the liquor in his glass came close enough that only a master could feel the difference on his tongue. Once he felt that nearness, greed braided with fear. Royce told himself no one man should sit on something that might keep several families afloat. He started bringing his boys into the shed, then 2 Kincaid cousins from over the hill, showing them how to mash, fire, and cut. Around the work he spoke of our brand and our future, careful never to say where the idea had truly come from. With every new set of eyes on that copper, the old rule against touching another man's craft weakened, even if no one dared to say that part out loud. The open break came at a fall hog roast near the county line. Fires burned low, kids chased each other with sticks, and a band picked old songs on a flatbed truck. Royce moved through the crowd with a crate of clear jars, telling anyone who would listen that he had a new run, smoother than anything they had tasted. He called it Kincaid Clear. When a cup finally reached Eli, he lifted it, breathed once, and knew his father's work sat in another man's hand. He said nothing. Each man who praised whiskey stepped, unseen, onto a list that would end in blood. The hog roast kept humming around Eli while that cup of Kincaid Clear burned his tongue. Fiddles sawed on the flatbed, kids swung from a low tree limb, men laughed at the same old jokes. Royce moved on to the next circle, thumping backs, pouring more from his crate, soaking up praise that didn't belong to him. Eli set his cup down on a folding table and walked away without a word. No one stopped him. In a place where men carried whole storms behind their eyes, folks knew better than to grab an arm and ask what was wrong. He crossed the gravel lot, climbed into his old truck, and sat with his hands wrapped around the wheel. The music came through the glass in a dull blur. For a moment, he let himself picture going straight to Sheriff Hensley. He imagined handing over a jar, telling the sheriff where the design came from, who had stood by his still for years, what had been taken. In his mind, Boyd listened close, took notes, and marched out papers that said a recipe, a still shape, a way of cutting shine could be owned and guarded by law the way a car title or house deed could. Then the picture broke. Eli knew better. Law cared that the liquor was made at all, not whose name rode quiet on the taste. In any courtroom, his own guilt sat first in line. His father had never needed a piece of paper or a judge to say what was his. Men in those hills held their claim by work, by years, by word. When somebody cut in on that, you didn't mail a form. You settled it your own way, or you swallowed it and let your children learn that their name meant nothing. He turned the key, let the engine catch, and drove away from the music and smoke. The road climbed past Black Locust and Bare Oak, then dropped toward a narrow pull-off that looked over the hollow. He eased the truck onto the gravel, killed the lights, and sat in the dark with the engine ticking. Stars burned hard above the ridge. Down below, porch lights blinked between trees. Somewhere in that mess of yellow dots lived every man who had lifted Royce's new jars and called them fine. From the glove box, he took out a small spiral notebook and a short pencil. He stared at the first blank page until faces began to settle in his mind. Royce, of course, at the center. His oldest boy who had leaned so close in the shed. 2 cousins from over the hill who bragged soft at the store about their new run. A driver with a loud laugh who had started hauling for Royce instead of Eli last month. A man from the next county who had come around more than once, asking too many questions about that clean Walker cut. Eli wrote each name in a column, leaving space beside them. He marked little circles where he knew things other men might not. When one always drove home drunk from the VFW, when another slipped out early on Thursdays to run cards in a back room, who still hunted alone at daybreak. Years of watching and listening, years of rides given and work shared had filled his head with a quiet map. Now he laid that map on paper. At the far edge of the page, he drew a line and wrote another list, men who owed him or his daddy favors. The store owner whose mortgage he had once helped catch up in cash that had no name. A cousin who kept cattle on Walker grass during a dry year. a bait shop man whose boy Eli had pulled away from pills, a retired foreman who still remembered which miner had stepped between fists in a dark seam. None of them knew yet that they sat on a different sort of ledger. Sitting in that truck, Eli made two choices that fixed his path. First, he decided there was no use trying to use courts or papers to reclaim what had been taken. The system that had let mines close and men fall through cracks would not rise up now to defend an old copper shape and a family cut of shine. Second, he decided he would not storm straight at Royce and his sons in some loud, wild burst. That kind of move would bring law down fast and leave half the work undone. Instead, he would pull threads. One man at a time, he would use his old ties to set moments when a nephew drove alone, when a cousin walked a road without company, when a driver took a back route with no witness. He would ask for small things from his allies, nothing that broke their code outright, just a quiet word about when someone left the house, a ride not offered, a door not opened. Enough to leave each marked man standing by himself when the time came. Pencil resting on the page, Eli stared at the list until the names blurred. A chill settled in his chest, not from the air, but from knowing what he had just planned. He closed the notebook, slid it back into the glove box, and sat in silence. In his own mind, he wasn't turning into a villain. He was drawing up a ledger his father would have understood. Wrong on one side, balance on the other. The pact was made there on that ridge, with no witness but stars and the dark line of timber between his hill and Royce's. Eli drove off the ridge with the notebook in the glove box and a tight ache behind his ribs. Gravel snapped under the tires as the truck rolled down toward the hollow. When he pulled into the yard, only a sliver of light showed under the kitchen door. Lena had left the porch dark. He shut off the engine and sat a long second in the quiet cab before going in. The kitchen smelled like stale coffee. A pot of beans cooled on the stove. In the front room, Lena slept in her chair with a quilt over her knees, the television buzzing gray. Eli watched her chest rise and fall, saw the tired lines around her mouth, and felt the weight of what she didn't know yet. He clicked off the set, pulled the quilt higher, and walked to the bedroom. Sleep came in broken bits, each dream turning back to the white paper of that notebook with names marching down it. Morning fixed none of it. The next days blurred into chores and silent planning. Eli fed hogs, checked fences, split wood, until the handle burned blisters into his palms. The list in the glove box waited. By midweek, he was ready to move on the first name that sat closest to Royce, the oldest nephew, the one who bragged most and listened least. The bait shop by the river made a good place to start tugging his old favors. It sat low on cinder blocks, boards gone gray, with a faded picture of a fish nailed by the door. Men came there for worms, soda, and news. Eli came for Carl. Years back, when the bank man circled, Eli had slipped an envelope of cash under that man's door. Kindness like that did not vanish. It sank roots. Inside, the shop smelled of minnows and damp paper. Carl wiped his hands on a rag when Eli stepped in. They spoke first of the river, of a boy who had pulled a big catfish from a deep hole last week. Then Eli lowered his voice and asked Carl to let him know when Royce's nephew came through alone with a cooler and talk of a late run. Carl's jaw tightened. He didn't ask why. In that county, the reason behind a favor was often left alone. He only nodded once, slow. 3 evenings later, the phone rang sharp in the Walker kitchen. Lena answered, then turned with the cord tight in her hand and the receiver held out to Eli. Carl's thin voice on the line carried news. The nephew had just left the shop at dusk, heading up past the old strip mine, with a truck bed full of boxes and no one riding behind him. Eli thanked him and hung up. He moved steady, not fast. The rifle came from behind the bedroom door, checked by habit, laid across the front seat. Outside, the air held that damp chill that slides off rock after sundown. He drove toward the dark line of the strip mine road, past bare trees and old tire tracks, until the pavement gave way to rough stone. At the mouth of the old company road, he eased the truck across most of the lane and cut the lights. Night pressed close. The only sounds were a small creak in the ditch and the slow tick of cooling metal. He waited, eyes on the bend below. Headlights showed at last, bouncing over ruts and growing brighter. Eli slid the rifle barrel out the window and set it against the frame. The younger man's truck rolled closer, slowed at the sight of a vehicle blocking the way, and drifted to a stop 10 yards off. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Eli squeezed the trigger. The crack tore through the trees and came back in a faint echo. The nephew's head fell toward the wheel, horn blaring once before dying. Eli stepped out, checked for any breath, and laid a small strip of bright copper on the hood, before turning his truck around and letting the dark swallow the scene. Gravel and leaves covered Eli's tracks before the first set of headlights found that nephew's truck. A hunter headed to a far ridge saw the shape on the strip-mined road at dawn and backed away fast, hands shaking on the wheel. By mid-morning, the sheriff's car sat there, lights turning slow, while deputies took pictures and marked shell casings. Word ran through the county before lunch. One of Royce's boys was dead. Folks didn't say much out loud, but they looked at each other a little longer than normal. On the Walker place, Eli split kindling by the woodpile. Each swing landed true. He heard Lena's radio in the kitchen and the low murmur of a news break. Her voice floated out once, calling his name, then fell quiet. When she stepped onto the porch, her face had gone pale. She said someone had shot that Kincaid nephew on the strip mine road. She watched his eyes like she was trying to read more than the words on his face. Eli only nodded, wiped sweat on his sleeve, and went back to the wood. The first killing shook more than one house. Up above town, an old coal tipple rusted over the hill where the mine once fed trucks and trains. Its metal sides were streaked with red, the chutes long empty. Grass pushed up through cracked concrete. For years, the place had been where men met to talk about union votes, shift changes, and later, layoffs. Now it stood as a hollow shell, a good place for a quiet talk, away from kitchen windows. Eli drove there that evening as the sun slid behind the ridge. His truck rolled under the shadow of the tipple. The old foreman, Hank, already waited, leaning against a support beam with his hands in his jacket. Hank's beard had gone white, but his eyes stayed sharp. He had once been Eli's boss underground, the man who decided which crew went where and who shared air with whom. Eli had stepped between him and angry fists more than once. They spoke first about simple things, weather, a grandson's school, the price of hay. The hollow carried every sound, so both men kept their voices low. After a time, talk bent toward the dead nephew. Hank said it was bound to happen, the way some boys ran their mouths. He did not say Eli's name in that breath, but the space between words made it clear he knew this was no road rage or drunk accident. Eli told him he needed one small thing. Royce's cousin, another name on that folded page, liked to stop by Hank's place on Friday nights to drink and brag before heading home late. Eli wanted Hank to tell him the cousin had to leave early this week, to let a man rest his bones, and send him down a back road at a set time. No lies about danger, no forced trip, just a nudge that would leave the man driving alone through a bend with no houses near. Hank's jaw worked as he listened. The tipple's metal skin popped and clicked in the cooling air. He looked past Eli toward the dark mouth of the old mine road, then back at the man he had once trusted with a pick and a lifeline. Finally, he shook his head. He said he owed Eli for old days, for that time a fight in a narrow seam ended with words instead of broken teeth. But asking him to steer a man toward a bullet crossed a line he could not cross and still sleep. Silence settled heavy. In another year, in a different kind of trouble, Eli might have backed down. Pride and hurt sat too deep now. He told him he understood, though the words felt like rocks in his mouth. There would be no threat, no shout, only a small crack opening between them that had never been there before. They left without shaking hands. Driving away, Eli felt that crack as sharp as any cut. Each time he used his old ties to pull one thread, another tie frayed or snapped. The cost of his plan was no longer written in blood on lonely roads, it was also tallying up in the shrinking number of men who would still meet his eyes. He knew even then that by the time his list ran out, he might stand alone on that hill, with his sons, and very few others willing to speak his name. Sunday came with a thin gray sky and the smell of rain pressed down in the valley. Lena laid out the boys' shirts on the bed and set Eli's one good sport coat over the chair. Church was not a place for loud talk or hard glances, but it was where news traveled fastest. Even before the Kincaid nephew died, women passed word there about layoffs, sickness, and which families needed help. Now another kind of story rode under the hymns. In the truck, on the way down the hill, Jesse stared out his window, jaw tight. Mark traced a line in the fog on the glass with one finger. No one said the Kincaid name, though all three had heard the radio and the neighbors murmur over the fence. Eli drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes on the wet road. Lena watched him in the side mirror and felt the quiet, like a live thing between them. The little white church sat on a low rise beside the road. Cars filled the grass. The bell rope swung once, twice, calling folks inside. Warm air met them at the door, heavy with perfume, coffee, and the tang of old wood. Children ran ahead to the front pews, while older men eased into the back rows. At the center aisle, Lena slowed, feeling eyes slide over her family and away again. During the first hymn, her voice shook. She saw Mrs. Kincaid, Royce's sister, sitting 2 pews back, face drawn, hands locked around a folded tissue. Her husband was not with her. No one in that room had to ask why. The preacher spoke of mystery and judgment and the valley of the shadow of death, words that fit more than the reading. Every so often, Lena's gaze wandered to Eli's profile. His jaw was set. He sang low, steady, eyes fixed on the worn hymnal. After the service, the crowd poured into the fellowship hall. Folding tables bowed under bowls of beans, casseroles, and pies. Kids reached for cookies. Women formed tight circles and talked with heads close. Men stood near the coffee pot, trading weather and ball scores in dry voices. Yet whenever someone mentioned the killing on the strip mine road, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Lena moved between tables with a dish towel over her arm, helping clear plates. Snatches of talk drifted around her. Someone said the boy must have crossed the wrong man. Another muttered that folks ought to remember, you reap what you sow. A third just shook her head and whispered that it was a shame, no matter what he'd done. No one named Eli, but something in the way glances slid toward him and then away told her they did not see the death as random. Near the punch bowl, 2 younger women spoke low about Royce himself. They said he had been teaching any fool who'd stand still how to cook, that he bragged about a new shine better than Walker's. One said her husband had refused to help haul jars last week, feeling trouble close. The other said her cousin had turned Royce away from a spare room, using a sick child as the excuse. Lena wiped a plastic cup and listened, heart thudding. Eli's quiet talks around town had already started to move the ground under the Kincaid men. Doors were closing for them, not all at once, but enough to leave them standing more alone than before. It felt like watching a storm build from inside her own kitchen, knowing her husband's hands were part of the wind. When they finally stepped back into the chill air, Jesse walked ahead with his fists in his pockets, shoulders stiff. Mark lagged, looking from the Kincaid car to his father's face, as if trying to fit pieces together. Lena slipped her arm through Eli's. She didn't ask what he was doing. She only said the town felt different, and that too many people seemed to be scared to look anyone in the eye. Eli squeezed her hand once, a small answer that gave away nothing and everything at the same time. Late Sunday, after the fellowship hall emptied and the last car pulled away from the church lot, Eli drove his family back up the hill in near silence. Gravel clicked under the tires. The sky had turned the flat color of ash, and the air felt thinner, colder. Jesse sat rigid on the passenger side, eyes on the dark trees. Mark leaned against the rear window, watching his own breath fog the glass. Lena folded her hands in her lap and studied the tight line of Eli's mouth. Nobody spoke the Kincaid name. Nobody had to. At the house, routine wrapped around them like an old quilt. Jesse hauled in wood and stacked it by the stove. Mark fed scraps to the hound and rattled dishes as he helped his mother. Lena moved through the kitchen with small, sharp motions, putting leftovers into jars, wiping the same spot on the counter twice. Eli hung his coat on the nail by the door, then stepped back outside before anyone could ask where he was going. The yard felt different now. The same barn leaned against the same slope. The same oak tree reached up bare into the evening sky, yet everything seemed moved a half step towards some edge. Eli crossed the frozen dirt, boots crunching, and took the narrow path behind the barn. Laurel brushed his sleeves. A crow called once from higher on the ridge, then went quiet. The still site lay in a fold of the hill, hidden from the road by rock and brush. Eli lifted the tarp and let the lantern light spill over dented copper and blackened fire brick. Here was the heart of the whole war, not a bank account or truck title, but this shaped metal that his father had trusted him with. He ran his hand along the curve of the pot and felt every strike of the hammer that had formed it. Somewhere down their own hollows, Royce's copied rig sat waiting, cheap echoes of this one. He set the lantern on a rock and took out the folded sheet from his pocket. The paper had softened at the creases from being opened so often. 13 names filled the page. One had a careful mark through it for the nephew on the strip road. 2 more he had drawn faint lines beside after hearing in town that they were packing to leave the state. Fear had started doing part of his work. Others, including Royce himself, sat bare, waiting. Beside each name he had written hard facts: where a man worked, what roads he liked, who he visited on Thursday nights, how much he drank when he felt bold. In another column, he had small notes about people who had quietly agreed to help by doing almost nothing. The store owner would change a delivery day. Carl would phone when a truck rolled out alone. A cousin had promised not to give shelter to any Kincaid kin until things calmed. Each small choice left one more stretch of road or riverbank thin of witnesses. Looking at the sheet, he could see the night ahead as if it had already passed. He would move ridge to ridge, using old logging tracks and deer paths, timing his steps to the lives on that list. A cousin headed home from cards would meet his headlights on a blind curve. A driver rolling slow past a pull-off would glance over to see a familiar truck, then never look again. One by one, the stolen pieces of his legacy would fall like boards from a barn. Mist hung low over the river that Monday morning, a thin gray veil between the hills. A man easing his truck toward a favorite deer stand cut his lights as he neared the shallow ford. When he stepped out to check the water, a dark shape by the gravel bar caught his eye. It looked wrong in the half-light, too still, too heavy. As he walked closer, boots crunching on frozen mud, the outline of a body took form beside the rocks. The man stopped, breath caught high in his chest, and backed away without getting any closer. By 7, the county dispatcher had logged the first 911 call, the hunter's voice thin and shaking through the line. He said there was a man down by the ford, looked gone already, truck door standing open on the bank. A deputy headed that way with lights off and coffee still cooling in the cup holder. The radio crackled soft in the cab as he rolled along the narrow road, tires sliding now and then on frosted patches. He had no idea that his call wouldn't be the last. Not 20 minutes after the first report, another came in. This time it was a school bus driver on a back route who had seen a pickup sitting sideways across a one-lane stretch near the strip mine road. A body hung half out of the cab. Kids on the bus had started to stand up and point before the driver shouted for them to sit. He turned that big yellow rig around in 3 careful moves and called it in as soon as he found a phone. The dispatcher's pen scratched faster across the log page. 2 scenes, miles apart, both male, both down in or near old bootlegger paths. A third call followed close behind from a woman who had taken an early shift at the plant across the line and noticed a sedan nosed into the ditch at a blind curve. No movement inside, no house in sight. By 8 o'clock, Sheriff Boyd Hensley had pushed back from his desk, grabbed his coat, and told Deputy Sarah Collins they were rolling. At the river ford, yellow tape fluttered weak around low shrubs. The hunter sat on his tailgate, face gray. The deputy who'd arrived first stood near the body, notepad in hand. Boyd stepped closer, eyes scanning without hurry. Middle-aged man, jeans, flannel shirt, winter coat open. No sign of a struggle in the gravel, no deep tire ruts like someone had fought to get away. A single dark hole low in the chest. On the river rocks, a glint of something bright caught his attention. Sarah bent, lifted a thin strip of copper with a gloved hand, and slipped it into an evidence bag. Up on the strip mine road, another team worked around the truck blocking the lane. This scene carried the same quiet. No wild skid marks, no broken brush, no second set of prints. Just a man slumped over the wheel, glass starred from a bullet, horn long dead. A bit of copper lay on the hood there too, bright as a penny against the dull paint. An officer fresh from the academy said it looked like a message. No one argued. As the morning wore on, scenes kept coming. A man in an old sedan on the narrow road by the railroad cut. Another slumped on the steps of a hunting cabin, thermos spilled beside him, coffee steaming into the cold air when first found. One leaned back in the seat of his car at a pull-off overlooking the valley, as if he'd stopped to admire the view and never rose again. Each time, the same marks showed, a clean shot, usually from the front or side, often through glass, always fast. At 3 of the sites, more of that odd copper stripe lay in easy sight, like a calling card no one outside the hills understood. By late morning, Boyd stood in the courthouse parking lot with his hands on his hips, looking at the line of sheet-covered forms going into the back of the coroner's van. He knew every last name on the tags without looking. Kincaid. 2 cousins. A driver he'd once warned about hauling at night. A man from over the hill who'd lately been seen too often in Royce's yard. Taken together with the nephew on the strip road, the count had reached 13. Scanner chatter bounced around kitchen tables and truck cabs all over the county. People heard the locations, matched them to the men they knew walked those roads, and felt cold settle in their chests. This was no random spree, no stranger passing through. Someone had walked the same map they all carried in their heads and used it like a blade. In the middle of that map sat Royce Kincaid and his bright new shine. One name, not yet on any body tag, but already at the heart of every whispered guess. By late afternoon, the sheriff's office looked more like a war room than a quiet piece of county government. Maps of the hills were spread across a scarred table. A big county road map hung on the wall, edges curled, push pins blooming red where the bodies had been found. Coffee steamed from a stained pot on a filing cabinet, long past fresh. Phones rang, then fell silent, then rang again. Sheriff Boyd Hensley stood in front of the map with his hands on his hips. He'd grown up on those same roads. He knew every bend and creek name, every little church hollowed out by time. Now he saw them through new eyes. 13 pins marked a loose circle around town. None sat on the main highway. Every one lay on a back road, a logging trail, a river ford, or a pull-off only locals used. Deputy Sarah Collins shuffled a stack of fresh reports on the desk behind him. She read them out loud, one by one, checking each against the map. Same kind of bullet, same clean shot, same lack of struggle. Vehicles left running or only just stopped, like the dead men had never felt the danger until it hit. At 4 scenes, bagged in separate envelopes, lay those bright pieces of copper. The lab in the city would test them, but Boyd didn't need a scientist to tell him they were not left there by chance. On a legal pad, Sarah had written the names of the dead in a single column. Beside each one, she listed how they made their money, who they were kin to, and anything else worth noting. Even a quick look showed a pattern. Several wore the Kincaid name. Others were married into that line. A few were from over the ridge, but someone had already said they'd been working with Royce this past year. At the bottom of the page, in a different ink, she had circled one more name, Royce Kincaid, still alive and nowhere to be found. Boyd tapped the map with a blunt finger. He said whoever pulled those triggers knew these hills like a birthright. They picked spots where a truck could sit a long time before another soul came by. They knew when a man left for cards or work and how far he'd go before anyone missed him. That wasn't some outsider drifting through. That was homegrown. Sarah asked if it might be a drug deal gone bad, maybe something bigger out of the city. Boyd shook his head. Big city work didn't spread out slow and neat like this. It burned hot in one place, then ran. This looked more like a list being checked, careful and cold. They went over the week leading up to the killings, the nephew on the strip mine road, the whispers about Royce's new shine, the small shifts in routine that folks had started to mention if you pressed them just right. One man had left the VFW early for the first time in years because the card table didn't feel right. Another had been told by his cousin's wife that they weren't taking company for a while. Little things, but together they sounded like doors closing. In a quiet corner of the board, Sarah pinned up two more names, Elias or Eli Walker and his two sons. They weren't suspects yet, not on paper. Still, every time she asked who knew Shine best, who kept to himself, who had reason to hate Royce's new brand, the same surname drifted back, Walker. Some folks answered that question with open respect. Others did it with their eyes on the floor, like they were afraid the walls might be listening. Boyd stared at that name a long moment. He knew Eli from school days and mind shifts. He knew the man's limp, his patience, his deep, stubborn pride. He also knew there'd never been a call about Eli lifting his hand in anger without cause. A man like that didn't fit the easy picture of a wild killer. But this wasn't wild. It was steady, planned, almost military. The sheriff felt the back of his neck prickle. By evening, the first pressman from the city had called, sniffing after the Kentucky Hill Massacre. Boyd gave him almost nothing, just the count and the fact that all victims were local men. Inside, though, the sheriff's own picture was sharpening. 13 dead, nearly all tied by blood or business to Royce Kincaid. Copper traces hinting at still work. Roads chosen by someone who understood that code better than any lawyer. Waiting out on those ridges, a man who understood that code better than any lawyer was waiting to see what the law would do next. By Tuesday mid-morning, the little diner on Main Street felt like the only warm place left in town. Rain had moved in overnight, leaving the road outside slick and black. Inside, steam rose from plates of eggs and gravy. Boots scuffed the worn floor. Silverware clicked, then went still whenever the radio on the counter broke into a brief update about the ongoing investigation into the multiple homicides. Every booth was full, but most voices stayed low. At a corner table, a man from the city sat alone with a coffee and a small notebook. He'd driven down from Lexington before dawn, following scanner chatter and a tip about mountain men settling scores. To the locals, he just looked like another stranger passing through. Clean shirt, short hair, glasses that fogged when he came in from the damp. Only the notebook and the little recorder in his pocket marked him as a reporter. At the top of the page, he had already written a headline idea: The Kentucky Hill Massacre. Conversations drifted around him, whether anyone meant them to or not. Two older men at the counter talked about the bodies the way they might talk about weather. They named the river ford, the strip mine road, the pull-off by the railroad cut. Each place matched a red dot the reporter had seen marked on a map at the sheriff's office. When they turned from locations to surnames, his pen slowed. Kincaid. Another Kincaid. A brother-in-law who'd been running with Royce. A driver known to haul jars for the same crew. The pattern everybody in town felt without saying now sat in a neat row of ink. Near the window, 3 women in work pants and fast food shirts leaned close over their cups. One said it was just evil, a sin, all those men dropped in one night, no trial, no chance to make things right. Another answered that sin had walked in earlier, when a man took another man's recipe and still shape and taught it to any fool who'd stand still long enough. The third stared at her hands and said she had cousins tied to both sides and didn't even know what to pray for. The reporter kept his head down and wrote down the words they used: murder, mountain justice, stealing from blood. At the far end of the counter, a young mechanic said the killer, whoever he was, belonged in a cell forever. He said times had changed, that there were courts now, and if a man's trade got stolen he could sue or move away, not go hunting other fathers on back roads. An older woman beside him shook her head. She said courts had watched mines close, pensions get cut, pain pills eat whole families, and most of the time no one important answered for it. Her voice carried the tired sound of someone who had buried more than one kind of loss. More than once, the reporter heard another name spoken in the same quiet tone folks used at funerals and court days: Walker. Some said it straight, saying they'd always known Eli Walker had more pride than he had land, and that a man like that might take theft harder than most. Others lowered their eyes and only called him that Walker up on the hill, then added that he'd helped folks out when times were lean, that he wasn't the sort to swing wild just for the pleasure of it. No one claimed to know for sure who drove those roads Sunday night, but very few said they believed it was a stranger. One change stood out. Years before, people had praised Royce Kincaid as much as they joked about him, calling him a good talker and a man who could move anything to anybody. In the diner that day, his name tasted different in their mouths. Several said they'd turned him away in recent weeks, unwilling to house his boys or haul his new shine. A waitress wiping down the counter quietly said that when you bragged on another man's craft as if it was your own, you were asking for trouble to come knocking. No one rushed to defend Royce now. His wide circle of handshakes and favors had shrunk to a few uneasy mentions and a lot of silence. When the reporter finally stepped back out into the damp street, he had pages of notes and a story that didn't fit neat into good and bad. This wasn't only about bodies on side roads, it was about a town arguing with itself over what justice meant when the law had never protected the thing at the center of the fight: a craft, a name, a sense of what a man could call his. Some saw a cold killer, some saw a hard edge of an old code. The massacre had not just taken 13 lives, it had split open the question of whose rules really ruled those hills. 2 days after the bodies turned up, low clouds pressed on the hills. Inside the sheriff's office, maps covered a table, coffee gone bitter on the warmer. The early call from the coroner had settled one last question. Dental charts matched the man found slumped in the car at the valley overlook. The face had been burned, but the teeth told the truth. That body was Royce Kincaid, head of the stolen shine. With Royce named, the list sat stark. 13 men dead, counting the nephew on the strip road. Every one was tied by blood or trade to Royce's new whiskey. The line through the county was clear now, a single network cut along its length. At the edge of that line, just outside the circle of pins on the map, one other name hovered in Boyd Hensley's thoughts: Elias Walker, owner of the only still worth stealing. Deputy Sarah Collins stood beside him, reading from fresh notes. No gun recovered, no clean eyewitness, strange phone calls before the killings, small shifts in habit, card games broken up early, spare beds denied to Kincaid boys, rides not offered when they once would have been. Folks never said Eli's name first, yet when Sarah let questions drift toward who had reason and who knew these roads best, that surname kept slipping back like a stone in a creek. Boyd knew he could not stand in town and pretend the law had no answer. Letting whispers and old codes finish the matter would mean giving up what little faith people still had in him. Whatever he felt about Eli as a boy he'd known since school, he now had to treat him as a man who might have walked those back roads with a rifle. By mid-morning, 2 cruisers eased out of the lot and headed up toward the Walker farm. The climb felt longer than usual. Trees leaned over the narrow lane, dripping cold water on the windshields. Mailboxes slid by in order: Collins, Howard, Kincaid, then Walker at the top of the hill. When the house came into view, it looked small against the gray sky, porch sagging, smoke from the chimney rising straight. Jesse stood by the woodpile, axe in hand. He stopped mid-swing as the blue lights turned into the yard and tires crunched to a halt. Lena stepped into the doorway, dish towel over her shoulder. One hand caught the frame. Mark moved in behind her, thin and pale. Eli came last. He walked out with his hands empty, wiping them on his pants, eyes moving from the cars to the badges. Whatever surprise he felt stayed deep. On the surface, he looked like a man called away from work, not shocked that the law had finally reached his gate. Boyd told him they needed him down at the office, spoke the required lines about rights and charges. Eli listened without blinking, then turned his palms out from his sides. No gun at his hip, no shout, only a brief glance toward Lena and the boys. Jesse took half a step forward, then stopped when his father's eyes met his. Lena bit her lip hard enough to leave a mark and held on to the frame. The cuffs clicked around Eli's wrists, silver bright against worn flannel. It was the first time steel had ever closed on him. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, knowing only shapes, and knowing enough. As Boyd guided him to the cruiser, one fact hung over the yard like the low clouds. The law was finally taking the man they believed had done the killing. Yet the real war had already ended. Royce's crew lay in the ground. His whiskey was tainted. The network built to carry stolen Walker Shine had been broken by the same quiet man now ducking into the back seat, riding down the hill toward a different kind of reckoning. Winter bled into spring before Elias Walker ever saw the inside of the courtroom. In the months between his arrest and his trial, the story of the Kentucky Hill Massacre had spread far beyond the county line. Papers in Lexington and even farther off ran pieces with pictures of the ridge, the rusted tipple, and the small white church. Talk shows guessed motives. Some called Eli a cold-blooded killer. Others leaned on the word vigilante. None of them knew the smell of that laurel thicket where the real heart of it had started. On the first morning of trial, the courthouse steps filled before the doors opened. Men in work jackets stood in small knots. Churchwomen clutched Bibles and purses. Reporters threaded between them with cameras and long cords, asking anyone who would stop how it felt to live in a place where 13 men had fallen in one night. Most locals kept walking. They had their own ideas about what had happened, and they did not care to offer them up for cable news. Inside, the courtroom seemed too small for the weight it held. Wooden benches creaked under the press of bodies. The judge's bench loomed over a room where nearly every name on the jury list tied back, in some way, to a mine, a farm, or a church in those hills. At the defense table sat Eli, thinner than when he'd gone in, hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the judge's shoulder. Lena sat behind him with Jesse and Mark, their faces pale in the harsh light. The state laid out its case in straight lines. They showed maps with red marks for each body, photos of truck doors left open, glass starred with bullet holes, copper strips bagged and tagged. Ballistics experts walked through how the same type of rifle had fired most of the shots. Deputies and the sheriff told the jury about the pattern they'd found. Every victim tied by blood or business to Royce Kincaid's new shine. Witnesses from town took the stand and spoke of sudden phone calls, of card games broken up early, of Kincaid men turned away from spare rooms for the first time in years. Piece by piece, a picture formed of someone using old friendships and quiet hints to steer men down certain roads at certain hours. Network by network, the prosecutor said, the killer had cut Royce's operation away from safety and then from life itself. When it was the defense's turn, Eli's lawyer did not pretend his client was somewhere else that Sunday night. The proof of his movements, the notebook the deputies had found, the copper he had once bought for repairs, all sat in front of them. Instead, the defense pulled on different threads. They called old miners who spoke about how Eli had settled fights underground, how he had stepped between anger and harm. They brought in widows who remembered envelopes under their doors when paychecks stopped coming. Most of all, they turned the light toward Royce Kincaid's own web. Men admitted under oath that Royce had taken Eli's still pattern and passed it on like a party trick. Cousins described how he said, "our shine," when he showed them how to cut a run that was not his to give. A store owner testified that when Eli learned the truth, his hurt was quiet and deep, not wild. The defense did not excuse the killings. They tried to show the jury the world that shaped the choice. a place where no law would ever call a recipe or a copper curve property, but every man in those hills knew it was. In closing, the prosecutor used the phrase mass murder until it seemed to hang in the air. 13 counts, planning, precision, no mercy. He spoke of roads turned into hunting grounds and family names stained forever. The defense answered with legacy and erasure, with the idea that Eli believed, wrong as he was, that he was defending the last thing his line had to pass down. The judge's instructions were cold and clear. However the jury felt about old codes and hard times, the law saw dead men and a man who had placed himself at the center of their fall. After a long night in the jury room, the foreman stood and spoke the words everyone expected. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, when it came, left no doubt. Life stacked on life with no chance of walking free again. The state had claimed Elias Walker's body in years, yet tucked into the trial records, permanent and official, sat another truth, that Royce Kincaid stolen a legacy and spread it through a network Eli had then turned into a weapon. On paper, the law had won. In the stories people would tell after, the meaning of that win stayed far less simple. The state prison sat far from the hollows where the killings had taken place. Flat ground, razor wire, concrete walls. No laurel, no creek, no copper glinting under a tarp. From the yard you could see only more fence and a strip of sky that never changed with the seasons the way hill country sky did. That was where Elias Walker spent his days after the verdict. Walking slow laps on hard-packed dirt, hands behind his back, face turned toward a sun that felt farther away than ever. Years passed in a pattern as rigid as any shift schedule in the mine. A bell woke the cell blocks before daylight. Metal doors shuddered open. Men lined up for count, then shuffled to chow. Eli ate what was put in front of him, spoke little, and never cut in line. When the guards assigned him to the laundry, he took the job without complaint. Folding uniforms and feeding machines was work, and work had always been the only thing he trusted to pass time. Inmates sized him up when he first arrived. Some knew the story already from fold-out newspapers and late-night radio. "That's the one from Kentucky," they whispered, "the one who dropped all those men in one night." A few came close, hoping for a wild tale they could repeat in the tears. They expected boasting, maybe laughter about the law back home. Eli gave them nothing like that. He told them he was in on murder, that he had done what the jury said he'd done, and that there was no glory in any of it. Those who wanted legend drifted off to other stories. The prison chaplain kept notes on men who seemed heavy with something more than anger. Over time, his thin notebook gained a page with Walker Elias at the top. They spoke in a small room off the chapel, where cinder-block walls made every word seem to echo. Eli talked a little about the mine, about his father's hands on copper, about the way work held a life in place. When the chaplain asked about the night of the killings, Eli stared at the floor and said only that a man could be right about one thing and dead wrong about what he chose to do with it. Letters came now and then from home. Lena wrote early on about church suppers, the garden, the boys' jobs. Her script grew shaky over the years. Later envelopes held Mark's blockier hand, telling his father about the factory where he'd found work, the town he'd moved to where folks didn't know the Walker name. Jesse's letters were less often and shorter, marked with grease smears from the garage and a few tight sentences about keeping the land cleared. Eli read every line, folded the paper along the same creases until edges softened, and kept them in a small stack under his mattress. Now and again, a different kind of letter came through the mailroom. Someone from a distillery up north wrote wanting to consult with him on a heritage line of Kentucky whiskey, hinting at money. A television producer asked if he'd share the true method on camera for a documentary, promising a sympathetic angle. Those envelopes stayed sealed. He slid them back across the desk at mail call and shook his head. There would be no paper trail for the recipe, no second life for the still his father had built, only the weight of August and the dawn of a new season. Back on the hill, that copper sat under its tarp in the laurel, seasons turning over it. Deputies had searched once, guided by rumor, but the ravine hid its secrets well. In time, Jesse cut the rig apart and hauled most of the pieces out in feed sacks, scattering them in scrap piles and under barn floors. A single curved section he cleaned, polished, and set on a shelf in his own house, just a dull ornament to anyone who didn't know. The full run, the careful cut that had once drawn buyers from 3 counties, lived only in Eli's mind. When other inmates asked him if he missed the shine, he told them he missed mornings on his porch more than any jar. On lonely nights, when the block lay quiet, except for distant snores and the clank of keys, he sometimes saw the list of names from his old notebook as if it were pinned to the cell wall. The men he had hunted, the sons he had left to carry a story they hadn't chosen, the still he had sworn to protect, now gone, except for a twisted piece of metal in his boy's house and a weight in his own chest. By the time gray streaked his hair and his steps slowed to a shuffle, the massacre had become just another case file to the younger guards. To them, he was an old man with a limp and a stack of clippings in his folder. Only the chaplain and a few men from the hills knew that the thing he had killed to defend died too. Eli Walker had won his war against Royce Kincaid's network. The Kincaid shine was gone. Yet the Walker recipe walked with him only as memory, buried deeper every day, proving in the end that some victories leave nothing standing, not even the legacy they were meant to save. Outside the prison fences, the lives that had fed into Eli Walker's choice kept on moving, one slow day at a time. In the hollows, the same creeks ran, the same coal scars cut across hillsides, but the families tied to the massacre carried a new weight. Funerals had come and gone. Headstones now dotted graveyards for the 13 men who never came home from that November night. What remained were empty seats at tables, tools hanging on nails, jackets still on pegs by doors that no longer opened for their owners. On the Walker Hill, Lena's days narrowed. At first, she drove down to town for groceries and church like before, chin up, boys at her side. Faces turned away on Main Street now, or held a pity she could not stand. Some folks saw her as the woman who had raised a killer. Others treated her like someone who had lost a husband to an accident no one knew quite how to name. After a while, she shopped fast at odd hours and kept to her porch, folding laundry that never seemed to end. Jesse stayed on the land. He worked odd jobs, fixed fences, and kept the small herd of cattle moving from patch to patch. Neighbors who once borrowed tools now hesitated at the edge of his yard. They nodded from the road but rarely stopped. In their eyes, Jesse saw his father's shadow, even though he had never pulled a trigger that night. Children at school had already given his own kids a cruel nickname, Massacre Blood. When he heard it the first time, he tightened his jaw and sent the children back inside without a word. Mark had gone the other way. Soon after the sentencing, he packed a car with clothes and a few photographs and left for a factory town 2 states over. There he found work on an assembly line where nobody cared about his last name, only whether he showed up on time. He told new friends his father was gone and left it at that. At night, in his small apartment, he sometimes turned on crime shows, only to switch them off when cases too close to his own family's story came on. Distance dulled the sting, but never erased it. For the Kincaid families, the fallout cut in a different direction, but no less sharp. Royce's wife found herself with bills stacking on the table and a last name that drew cold stares at the store. Some in town still whispered that her husband had brought this on by stealing what was not his. Others invited her to church and pressed casseroles into her hands, saying no widow should pay for a man's choices. Her children heard 2 stories about their father, one of a smiling trader who made people laugh, and one of a thief who had crossed a line older than the county itself. In a church basement one winter, folding chairs scraped on linoleum as a small support group gathered. The pastor's wife had started it after the trials, inviting widows and mothers from every side. On one metal chair sat Royce's sister, eyes rimmed red. Across the circle sat a cousin of one of the other dead men. At first, they spoke only of chores, of children's grades, of leaky roofs. Over weeks, words grew braver. Someone said out loud that they were tired of choosing between blaming Eli alone or blaming the men who had followed Royce into his shed. Grief sat heavier in that room than any clear answer. They could not bring back sons or brothers. They could not undo the night Eli drove the ridges, or the nights years earlier when Royce had bragged over a run he had not earned. What they could do, slowly, was see each other as more than names in two feuding columns. Children played in a corner with crayons while their mothers talked. Those children would grow up with last names that still sparked whispers, yet in that room, for an hour, they shared the same worn rug. 2 decades after the night folks named the Kentucky Hill Massacre, the town had changed on the surface. Coal never did come back the way old-timers hoped. Empty lots where company houses once stood now held scrub and rust. A few trailers sat where streets had been planned and forgotten. The general store still opened its doors each morning, though the owner's hair had gone white and his notebook of debts sat thinner than before. What had filled the gap where shine once ruled was not the steady trickle of jars up and down the ridge. It was pills, then powders, then glass pipes. Prescription bottles with other counties' doctors on the labels showed up in kitchen drawers. Later, plastic baggies traded hands in high school parking lots and at the backs of gas stations. The old web that had carried Eli's whiskey and Royce's stolen version had rotted out, only to be replaced by new chains that ran through clinics, dealers, and strangers no one knew by name. On the hill where the Walker house still stood, Jesse watched that shift with hard eyes. He kept his cattle, mended his fences, and stayed clear of the new trade. When a cousin asked if he'd ever thought about getting back into the liquor, Jesse shook his head. There was no going back. The still was gone, except for one curved shard of copper on a shelf, its meaning private. Whatever honor had once clung to making clean whiskey in a hidden ravine had been drowned by what his father had done with a rifle. Down in town, a clinic with a bright sign offered treatment and recovery services. The same families who had whispered over jars now sat in plastic chairs under fluorescent lights, filling out forms for sons and daughters hooked on pills stronger than anything a still could turn out. A counselor who had moved in from the city saw the graveyard stones with the Kincaid and Walker names and only half understood why people flinched when they passed them. To her, they were part of an old story. To the locals, they were still burning. A young reporter at the weekly paper decided on the 20th anniversary to write a long piece about the massacre. She dug through old clippings, pulled trial transcripts from dusty boxes, and drove up the hill to look at the roads where men had fallen. Some neighbors refused to speak. Others sat on porches and told her about hard winters, empty paychecks, and the way everyone once knew who cooked what in which hollow. They spoke less about Eli's aim and more about his planning. Again and again, one line came up. He used what we all live by against us. In her story, printed across the front page and later shared online, she drew a straight line from the old shine networks to the pill routes now cutting through the county. When the law had tried to smash the first trade from the outside, people had shifted sideways and kept moving. When Eli had smashed a branch of it from the inside, fear had slowed things down, but only for a while. Within a few years, new dealers with no stake in the old codes were using the same back roads he'd once hunted, this time for something far worse. Churches had adapted in their own way. The same fellowship hall where women once whispered about the strip mine road killing now held support meetings for families dealing with addiction. In those metal chairs, Kincaid kin sometimes sat 2 rows from Walker kin. Younger folks didn't always know why their grandparents tensed when certain last names were read from the prayer list. The older ones felt the past and the present stack on top of each other like rough boards. Law enforcement changed too. Sheriff Hensley retired, his hair thin and his shoulders stooped from years of wearing the badge. A new sheriff ran on promises of tackling drugs and never letting another Walker situation happen on my watch. He brought in outside training on domestic disputes and narcotics, but he still had to work with the same small budget and the same spread-out roads. Deputies drove past the old massacre sites almost daily now, often on their way to overdose calls. In the end, the place did what such places often do. It bent, but did not quite break. The massacre sat in its memory like a scar, always there, sometimes sore, mostly talked about when outsiders came asking, or when the news needed a story with banjos and blood. Under that, daily life went on. Kids caught the bus, gardens grew, people punched clocks where they could. Yet for those who had lived through it, the sense lingered that once, in 1985, a man had taken the very thing that tied the community together, its web of favors and roads, and turned it into a weapon. And no amount of time or new kind of drug had ever fully undone what that choice revealed about the hills and the systems that failed them. Every long story about blood and hills carries two layers. One is the list of hard facts, dates, weather, names, charges, verdicts. The other lies under that, quiet but strong. It is the set of unwritten rules people live by when they feel the written ones have turned their backs. The Kentucky Hill Massacre sits right on that line between law on paper and law in the bones. To understand it, you have to hold both at the same time. On one side, the state's view never changed. 13 men were hunted and shot. The hunt was planned. The shots were clean. Elias Walker knew what he was doing each mile of that dark loop. A jury looked at bodies, maps, and a notebook full of names and could not call it anything but murder. Under that frame, the story is simple. A man got mad, reached for a gun, and crossed a line that no anger can excuse. Justice, as the court defines it, did what it was made to do. It took his freedom and marked his record for good. On the other side, the hills remember something more. Tangled. To many who grew up there, the first wrong step was not the pull of a trigger, but the bend of a copper sheet. Royce Kincaid, copying a still, teaching the run and claiming the praise, felt to them like stealing a gravestone and carving his own name on it. Law had no box for that kind of theft. The recipe was not a patent. The still design was not a brand on a store shelf. If Eli had gone to court, he would have stood in front of a judge as the criminal, not the harmed. Inside that gap between harm and rule, old codes woke up. That is where justice and revenge twist around each other. Eli told himself he wasn't killing for ego. In his own mind, he was standing guard over the only fine thing his line had made. Yet each shot took a father or son from another table. The same pride that kept him from letting the theft slide also kept him from seeing what that cost would do to his own family name. He set out to keep the Walker legacy from being washed away. In doing so, he poured so much blood over it that his children could not touch it without guilt. There is also the question of systems. The Hill Code that shaped Eli did not spring up in a clean world. It grew in a place where mines closed with little warning, where pensions shrank, where pills flooded in without anyone in a suit facing real time. When big wrongs seem to draw no answer, small communities start to answer wrongs by themselves. That is the soil where a man like Eli can see his act not as a break with order, but as a way to bring some kind of order back. It's a hard thought, but it lives in many such towns. Look at the way he used his strength. Eli's hidden power was never money or charm. It was a web of trust and memory. It kept lights on, filled freezers. In one season, he flipped it. The same quiet word that once meant a ride or a loan now meant a gap on a dark road. Network knockout, if you want to call it that, gave him reach far past what one rifle alone could have done. It also burned many of the bonds that kept that place from breaking. If you stand on that Kentucky hill today, the air feels no different than it did before the killings. Wind still works through the trees. Crows still ride the drafts over the old strip mine. Trucks still grind their way along the narrow road, heading to jobs, to school, to the store. The land doesn't show the 13 men who fell. Only the people do. A small cemetery sits on a rise above the hollow, fenced with rusting wire. The stones there carry names that once filled every mouth in town: Walker, Kincaid, Collins, Howard. Some markers are new, smooth granite catching the light. Others lean, letters fading under moss. Among them lies a row from the winter of 1985-86. Dates carved close together, ages too young. Visitors from outside the hills sometimes walk through, tracing those names with their fingers, thinking of headlines and true crime stories. Locals pass slower. For them, each stone holds a supper table that lost a chair. Jesse still comes up here from time to time. He parks his truck by the fence, leans on the hood, and looks out over the valley. On a clear day, he can see the line of trees that hides the ravine where the still once sat. The copper shard he kept from that rig rests on a shelf at home, dull now, more memory than metal. He never taught his own children the run. When they asked about their grandfather, he tells them two truths: that Eli worked hard and kept his word, and that he killed men in the name of something that could never be worth that cost. Mark, living states away, sometimes pulls up satellite images of the old roads on his phone. The map shows only lines and labels, not the fear he remembers. In his newer world, recipes belong to companies and lawyers, not families. Yet when someone jokes about hillbilly justice, he feels his jaw tighten. To him, the word walker is both a brand he can't fully claim and a burden he can't quite drop. Every few years, a podcast or documentary crew drives into town to retell the massacre. They bring cameras, microphones, and questions about why. They interview retired deputies, the old reporter with the notebook from the diner, churchwomen who remember casseroles and quiet weeping. They ask about the stolen still, about legacy, about honor. They take notes on how a man used his own community ties to pull 13 others into the ground. Then they leave, carrying footage and files back to studios far from those hills. The story they ship out is often neat: a wronged craftsman, a greedy thief, a bloody night, a prison sentence. But if you listen to the people who still live in that shadow, the edges never stay clean. Some say Eli was a monster who should have walked away and started over somewhere else. Others say he did what weak law never would and paid for it with everything he had. Most fall somewhere in the ache between those points, knowing that both theft and killing can be true and terrible at the same time. So now it comes to you. You're sitting with this story through a screen, miles or oceans away, bringing your own codes and scars to it. Maybe your people came from hills like these. Maybe you've only ever seen them in shows. Either way, you've heard what happened. A man watched his legacy stolen, lost faith in distant systems, and turned the very network that had held his world together into a weapon that broke it. If a court can't see the harm you feel, what would you do? Would you let the loss pass and teach your children that some things can't be kept? Would you fight inside the law, even if the law had never stood up for you? Or would you, like Elias Walker, take the code you grew up in and push it past the point where it can still be called justice? If this story speaks to something in your own family history, I'd ask you to share it in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. And if you want more long, hard looks at dark roads like this one, where law, legacy, and blood all collide, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next case. In the end, these hills raise one hard question for all of us. When the rules fail to guard what you love most, how far would you really go?